Your Honor, this deed proves my ownership. This is outrageous. This can't be real.
Order.
I will review this document.
And this is just the guest house. You should see the main property.
The boundaries crossed in the quiet heart of an affluent suburban community, where manicured lawns were measured in inches and every home seemed designed to reflect perfection. One man discovered the unsettling reality that boundaries could be erased without consent. His name was Michael, a soft-spoken professional who had inherited a sizable parcel of land on the edge of the neighborhood. Unlike most residents, who lived on quarter-acre lots, Michael's property stretched across several acres, filled with oak trees, open fields, and the kind of peaceful solitude that money couldn't easily buy. To Michael, the land was more than just dirt and trees. It was legacy. His father had purchased it decades earlier, when the suburb was still half rural, and had preserved it with the intention of passing it down. While neighbors constructed sprawling homes and pressed for modern amenities, Michael maintained a respect for the natural space. He allowed deer to wander, birds to nest, and wildflowers to bloom. The land represented both freedom and heritage, a reminder of a quieter life. Amid the growing pressure of development. But within the nearby homeowners association, that land was seen differently. It was considered wasted potential, a canvas on which someone with vision could etch their legacy. And no one believed in that vision more than Margaret, the HOA president. Margaret was a woman with influence, known for her sharp suits, perfectly coiffed hair, and unyielding grip on the neighborhood's image. She had earned a reputation as both admired and feared. Her authority within the HOA stretched beyond enforcing lawn colors or mailbox styles. She positioned herself as the guardian of property values, the gatekeeper of appearances, and the final voice on what was acceptable. And in her mind, Michael's sprawling, underutilized acres were an opportunity she simply couldn't let go to waste. It began subtly. Margaret would occasionally stop by to comment on how much potential the land held. She hinted at how other communities had transformed such unused areas into luxury spaces, suggesting Michael could profit if he chose to develop or sell. Michael politely deflected each suggestion, reminding her that the land was not for sale. But Margaret was not one to hear no. To her, resistance was only a temporary obstacle. Months passed, and strange activities began to stir on the border of Michael's land. Survey stakes appeared overnight, bright orange flags flapping against the wind. When he asked the HOA about them, Margaret brushed off his concerns with vague reassurances about routine evaluations. Michael trusted her explanation at first, unaware of the true scale of what was unfolding. Soon, contractors arrived. Heavy trucks rumbled down the road, delivering loads of concrete and steel. At first, Michael thought they were servicing one of the nearby properties. But when he returned home one afternoon, he found the machinery not across the street, not next door but directly on his own land. Confusion gave way to shock as he saw the beginnings of excavation in a clearing he had often walked through with his father years earlier. At first, he assumed it had to be a mistake. No one, not even Margaret, could possibly authorize construction without his consent. But when he confronted the foreman, he was met with clipped professionalism and paperwork bearing the HOAS stamp. According to the documents, the land had been repurposed under a new zoning initiative, an initiative Margaret herself had championed. She had presented the project as a community investment, claiming the area was common grounds that could be beautified for the neighborhood's benefit. Michael felt the ground shift beneath him. His private inheritance had been rebranded as public property without his knowledge, and at the heart of it was Margaret's determination. Within weeks, the excavation became foundations. Rebar rose like skeletal fingers from the earth, and cement trucks arrived in steady streams. Neighbors whispered about Margaret's vision of villa unlike any the neighborhood had seen before. A $6 million masterpiece designed to outshine every home within a 10-mile radius. Some applauded her ambition, eager for the prestige it might bring. Others grumbled quietly, unsure how one woman had the authority To build such extravagance on land that wasn't hers. Michael stood at the edge of the construction site night after night, staring at the growing structure with disbelief. He considered calling lawyers, filing reports, or halting the work with injunctions. Yet something in him held back. Margaret's arrogance was staggering, but so was her certainty. She had invested money, time, and her reputation into this build. The deeper the construction went, the more exposed she became. A seed of thought planted itself in Michael's mind. What if he let her continue? What if he allowed her to pour millions into a property she didn't legally own? Every dollar she spent, every brick she laid, only tightened the noose she had unknowingly tied around her own neck. And so, he made a choice. Against instinct, against anger, against the cries of his neighbors urging him to act, Michael decided to wait. He would document everything: photos, timestamps, official records. He would not stop the construction. Instead, he would let Margaret build her empire, piece by piece, wall by wall, until the villa was complete. Only then would he claim what was his dot as the months rolled on. The skeletal frame of the villa rose higher. Marble floors gleamed under the sun. Chandeliers were delivered in crates, and imported stone lined the exterior. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks to admire the progress, marveling at Margaret's audacity. She walked the site daily, barking orders with the confidence of a queen surveying her kingdom. But in the quiet shadows, Michael watched with a steady calm. His patience was not born of weakness but of strategy. The more Margaret built, the deeper her downfall would be, and by the time the villa stood finished, furnished, and polished into perfection, the only question remaining would be who truly owned it. The answer, Michael knew, would shatter Margaret's illusion of power. The crown of the neighborhood by the time the villa stood complete. It had become the centerpiece of the entire neighborhood. Rising above every other home, its grandeur commanded attention. Imported limestone gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting a soft golden hue that seemed to mock the modest brick and siding of surrounding houses. A wrought iron gate, custom designed and adorned with an intricate crest, marked the entrance to a driveway paved in marble tiles. Even from a distance, it radiated a sense of excess that no one could ignore. Margaret reveled in the spectacle. She paraded guests through the massive arched doorway, showing off chandeliers imported from Italy, ceilings painted with murals, and floors so polished they seemed to glow. She referred to the villa not as her home, but as the crown of the neighborhood. And for a while, her neighbors allowed her to bask in the glow of admiration. After all, many of them believed that rising property values would soon follow. Yet whispers never ceased. Some questioned how she managed to finance the construction. Others muttered about her audacity, wondering how she could simply take land that clearly wasn't hers. Michael's silence became a point of curiosity. Some thought he had been bought out, while others assumed he was too intimidated to challenge the HOA president. Margaret encouraged such rumors, allowing her reputation to swell unchecked. Inside the villa, luxury knew no restraint. A grand staircase swept upward into a gallery lined with portraits. The kitchen held appliances worth more than most residents' cars. A pool stretched across the backyard, complete with fountains and a heated deck. Margaret made sure every corner displayed wealth. Her strategy was simple: dazzle the neighborhood, silence dissent through envy, and present herself as untouchable. But not everyone admired her. The HOA meetings grew tense as residents began to question the association's budget. Where had the money gone? Why had fees increased? And why had the association been involved in acquiring land that, by every recorded deed, still belonged to Michael? Margaret dismissed their concerns with cold confidence, insisting the project had been for the greater good. Meanwhile, Michael remained deliberately silent. Outwardly, he appeared passive, even indifferent. He allowed the construction to finish, the villa to be furnished, and the celebrations to unfold. But behind the scenes, his preparation intensified. He had compiled every deed, tax record, and survey proving his ownership. He documented the placement of boundary stakes, the contracts Margaret had signed, and the discrepancies between the HOA's authority and the reality of property law. He sought quiet legal advice, ensuring his case was airtight, but instructed his lawyers not to act just yet. Timing, he understood, would determine the weight of his strike. Margaret grew bolder as the villa became her fortress. She hosted elaborate parties, inviting city officials, business partners, and HOA allies. Guests marveled at her taste and influence, unaware that each glass of champagne was poured on land she didn't own. The irony was not lost on Michael. From his modest home, just beyond the tree line, he would sometimes hear the faint echo of music drifting from the villa. Laughter carried into the night, along with the sound of fountains trickling in the courtyard. And yet, every note served as a reminder of how far Margaret had overreached. Neighbors began approaching Michael cautiously. Some apologized for not standing by him, confessing their discomfort with Margaret's power. Others urged him to take action, insisting it was the only way to restore fairness. Michael listened, nodding politely, but offered no clear answers. He was not ready to reveal his plan, not yet. For Margaret, the illusion of security hardened into arrogance. She began to act not just as HOA president, but as if she were the de facto ruler of the entire neighborhood. She issued new restrictions, tightening rules on landscaping, fencing, and renovations. Those who defied her were threatened with fines or legal action, and all the while, she held her villa as proof of her supremacy, claiming it symbolized what the neighborhood could aspire to if they followed her lead. But cracks began to form in her empire. The cost of maintenance soared, and rumors spread about unpaid contractors. Some whispered that Margaret had mortgaged heavily against her reputation, sinking every resource into the project. A few even suspected that she had diverted HOA funds into her private construction. Michael knew the time was drawing near. He watched as her pride swelled, as her debts deepened, and as her hold on the neighborhood began to fray. Each move she made pulled her further into the trap she had built for herself. And then, the moment arrived that would set the stage for everything to come. Margaret, in her grandest act of arrogance yet, organized an unveiling event and evening gala to officially declare the villa hers. Invitations were sent to every resident, along with city officials and local press. The neighborhood was abuzz with anticipation, ready to witness Margaret's triumph. Michael, however, prepared something very different. As the villa lit up with chandeliers and music filled the air, he gathered the evidence he had been building for months. The gala would be her moment of glory, but it would also mark the beginning of her undoing. Because when the lights dimmed and the guests applauded, Michael would be ready to reveal the truth, that the $6 million villa, the so-called crown of the neighborhood, did not belong to Margaret at all. It belonged to him. The gala of illusions, the evening of the unveiling, arrived with a grandeur that rivaled any social event the neighborhood had ever seen. The villa, illuminated by golden floodlights, shimmered like a palace against the night sky. Cars lined the streets for blocks. Sleek sedans and luxury SUVs carrying guests dressed in gowns and tuxedos. The air buzzed with anticipation as neighbors whispered about the spectacle awaiting them inside. Margaret orchestrated every detail with precision. From the red carpet rolled across the marble driveway to the string quartet performing near the entrance, she designed the event to exude power and prestige. Her ambition was clear. This was not just a housewarming party, it was a coronation. In her mind, the villa was her legacy, her proof of dominance, and her ultimate claim to immortality within the community. Guests marveled at the sight as they entered. Chandeliers glistened overhead, casting rainbows of light across walls lined with gilded mirrors. The grand staircase, with its sweeping curve and polished handrails, became a backdrop for photographs. Waiters carried silver trays of champagne, offering glasses to guests who wandered in awe through the lavish rooms. Each space was a carefully crafted display of wealth, velvet drapes, imported rugs, artwork worth small fortunes. Margaret drifted among them like a queen, basking in admiration. She laughed loudly, gestured broadly, and made certain every compliment was acknowledged. City officials praised her vision, reporters scribbled notes for glowing articles, and residents, whether genuinely impressed or begrudgingly compliant, nodded their approval. For a moment, Margaret seemed untouchable, but beneath the glittering surface, unease lingered. Some guests questioned how such extravagance had been funded. Others glanced toward Michael, who stood quietly in the background, observing. His presence was almost ghostly calm, composed. Unshaken by the spectacle, few noticed him, but those who did wondered why he appeared so collected, as if he knew something the rest did not. Margaret unveiled the villa with dramatic flair. At the center of the ballroom, she raised her glass, thanking everyone for their support and declaring the home a symbol of what the community could achieve. Applause thundered, cameras flashed, and her smile widened with triumph in her eyes. She had silenced every critic, erased every doubt, and cemented herself as the neighborhood's undisputed ruler. But Michael knew her empire was built on sand, and tonight the tide would begin to rise. As the party unfolded, Michael quietly slipped away from the main hall and returned with a small leather-bound folder. Inside were documents, deeds, surveys, maps, all meticulously organized. For months, he had built a mountain of evidence proving his ownership of the land. Margaret might have dazzled her audience with chandeliers and champagne, but the truth was stronger than any illusion she could cast. He did not rush. Timing was everything. He waited until the party reached its peak, until every guest had settled into the belief that Margaret's reign was unshakable. And then, with calm precision, he approached the group of city officials who had gathered near the front entrance. The room fell quiet as Michael laid the folder before them. He spoke with measured words, not raising his voice, but allowing the weight of the truth to settle over the crowd. The land, he explained, was his legally, indisputably, and without question. Margaret had built her villa not on common grounds, not on HOA property, but on land she had no right to touch. Every stone, every dollar, every ounce of labor had been poured into what was, by law, his estate. Gasps spread through the room. Whispers rippled like wildfire. The officials bent over the documents, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. Guests who moments earlier had praised Margaret now exchanged uneasy glances, their admiration dissolving into doubt. Margaret's face hardened. She laughed dismissively at first, waving off Michael's claim as absurd. She accused him of lying, of staging a desperate stunt. But as the officials flipped through the pages, deeds stamped, maps signed, boundaries clearly marked the dismissal. In her voice faltered. Her protests grew sharper, her tone more defensive. But the evidence spoke louder than she ever could. The music faltered. The waiters froze. The gala, meant to be Margaret's crowning glory, shifted into chaos. Neighbors began murmuring about betrayal, about deception, about the arrogance of a president who believed she was above the law. The admiration that had filled the villa only moments earlier now curdled into resentment. Michael stood silent through it all, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Margaret's unraveling composure. He had no need to shout or gloat. The truth was weapon enough, and its impact was devastating. By the end of the evening, Margaret's authority hung by a thread. She clung to her villa, insisting it was hers. But the seed of doubt had been planted in every guest's mind. The foundation of her power had cracked, and Michael had struck the first decisive blow. The villa still stood, glittering in the night, but the illusion was broken. What Margaret had claimed as her triumph was now revealed as her greatest vulnerability. And Michael knew this was only the beginning. The Faluth morning after the gala, the neighborhood awoke not to admiration, but to whispers that cut sharper than any blade. The villa, which had once gleamed as a symbol of triumph, now loomed like a monument to arrogance. Neighbors who had applauded the night before now exchanged uneasy glances as they watered their lawns or walked their dogs. Everyone had seen Michael's documents. Everyone had heard the officials' responses. And no one could shake the thought that their HOA president had built her empire on stolen ground. Margaret tried to carry on as though nothing had changed. She strutted through the streets, waving at passers-by, insisting that Michael's claims were baseless. She flooded the HOA newsletter with long-winded statements, declaring the villa a community asset and labeling Michael a troublemaker. But her words rang hollow. The evidence Michael presented had been clear, and the confidence that once shielded her now only made her seem desperate. The HOA meetings became battlegrounds. Residents who once feared Margaret began speaking out. They demanded to know how their association dues had been spent, why financial records were missing, and how the zoning initiative had been approved without their knowledge. Margaret, for the first time, found herself cornered. Her answers were vague, evasive, and laced with irritation. Every attempt to reassert control only fueled suspicion. Meanwhile, Michael's quiet presence unsettled her more than open defiance ever could. He did not grandstand. He did not argue in meetings. Instead, he attended calmly, listening while others challenged her authority. His silence was a constant reminder that the truth was on his side, and that he had no need to shout behind closed doors. Margaret grew frantic. She hired lawyers, demanded injunctions, and sought to discredit Michael's claim. She accused him of forging documents, of exploiting loopholes, of conspiring against her. But each investigation only confirmed the same conclusion. The land belonged to Michael. No interpretation of zoning laws or HOA bylaws could erase the fact that the villa sat squarely on his property. Contractors began demanding payment. Some had been promised funds that never materialized. Others had extended credit based on Margaret's reputation. When rumors spread that she had diverted HOA money to cover construction costs, residents erupted. They wanted audits. They wanted answers, and above all, they wanted accountability. The once united neighborhood fractured into factions. Some still clung to Margaret, unwilling to admit they had been fooled. Others sided openly with Michael, praising his patience and restraint. Many hovered in the middle, uncertain but increasingly convinced that their president had led them into disaster. Margaret's social calendar, once overflowing, began to empty. Invitations disappeared, phone calls went unanswered, and neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. The villa, once filled with guests and laughter, grew eerily quiet. Its lights still blazed at night, but the warmth had gone. It stood as a glittering prison for the woman who had built it. Michael, meanwhile, prepared his next move with methodical care. He worked closely with his attorneys, assembling a case so comprehensive that Margaret would have no escape. Every financial misstep, every misuse of HOA funds, every illegal authorization was documented. He filed claims not only for ownership of the land, but also for damages incurred by her trespass. The irony was staggering. The $6 million villa that Margaret flaunted as proof of her supremacy was, in reality, the strongest evidence of her downfall. The more lavish it appeared, the more glaring her overreach became. And yet, even as the walls closed in, Margaret refused to yield. She staged press interviews, insisting she was the victim of a smear campaign. She accused Michael of greed, of plotting to steal what she had built with her vision and leadership. But the cameras caught the cracks in her mask, the flash of panic in her eyes, the tremor in her voice. The community was no longer listening. They had seen too much for Michael. The moment of reckoning was near. The legal filings were complete, the court dates set, and the neighborhood now braced for the inevitable clash. Margaret had spent everything: her money, her reputation, her power on a villa that was never hers to begin with, and soon, the very crown she had placed on her head would be stripped away, not by force, but by the undeniable weight of the law. The villa still stood in all its splendor, but it was no longer a symbol of victory. It was a countdown, each day ticking closer to the moment when Margaret would lose everything. Michael knew it. The neighbors knew it. Deep down, even Margaret knew it. And as the court date approached, the neighborhood prepared for a spectacle unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Because soon, the battle would leave the sidewalks and the gossip and move into the courtroom, where illusions crumbled and only truth remained. The courtroom reckoningth day of the trial arrived like a storm the neighborhood could not escape. From early morning, cars filled the courthouse parking lot, their passengers buzzing with anticipation. This was no ordinary legal dispute. It was the culmination of months of whispers, rumors, and betrayal. For the residents, it felt less like a hearing and more like a public unmasking. Everyone wanted to see whether Margaret, the once untouchable HOA president, could survive the crushing weight of the truth. Inside the courthouse, tension hung heavy. Reporters lined the benches, their cameras poised. Neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder, their murmurs echoing in the vaulted chamber. At the center of it all, Margaret stood with her legal team, her face painted with forced confidence. She wore her finest suit, her posture stiff, her smile brittle, yet behind her polished facade, fear flickered. She had built her life on control. But here, in this room, control belonged to the judge, Michael entered with quiet composure. Unlike Margaret, he made no spectacle of his rival. He carried no entourage, no airs of superiority, just a slim folder of documents, the same kind he had unveiled at the gala. His calm presence unsettled Margaret more than any accusation could. He seemed immune to her bluster, as though he already knew how the story would end. The case opened with Margaret's defense. Her lawyers argued fiercely, claiming the land had been misclassified, that HOA bylaws allowed for community development, and that Michael had failed to object in time. They painted Margaret as a visionary unfairly targeted by a vindictive neighbor. Their words were sharp, their voices commanding, but their arguments wavered under scrutiny. Then came Michael's turn. He did not posture or dramatize. Instead, he laid out the facts with surgical precision. Deeds dating back decades, tax receipts with his family's name, surveys marking clear boundaries, all presented in perfect order, each piece of evidence stacked neatly atop the last, building a fortress of truth that Margaret could not scale. The courtroom leaned in as Michael's attorneys revealed financial records. They traced HOA funds redirected into villa expenses, contractor invoices paid from accounts meant for community maintenance, and discrepancies Margaret had tried to bury. What had once been rumor now stood exposed under oath. Every dollar misused, every signature falsified, every maneuver she had employed to mask her theft was displayed in black and white. Margaret's composure began to crack. Her voice rose in protest. Her hands trembled as she whispered urgently to her attorneys. She accused Michael of deceit, the contractors of betrayal, even her own board of incompetence. But the judge's expression remained unmoved, the gavel striking down interruptions with stern finality. Witnesses were called. Contractors testified about unpaid bills. Former HOA members admitted to being pressured into silence. And even a city official confessed that Margaret had misled them about zoning claims, each testimony carved deeper into the image she had worked so hard to preserve. The neighbors watched with conflicted awe. Some who had once supported her now hung their heads in shame, realizing they had enabled her reign. Others sat in grim satisfaction, vindicated for every fine and lecture she had imposed. To them, this was not just justice for Michael, it was justice for the entire community. Finally, the judge delivered the ruling. His words cut through the silence like a blade. The land, he declared, indisputably belonged to Michael. The villa, constructed without consent, was his by right. Margaret had trespassed, abused her authority, and violated the trust of both her neighbors and the law. Not only would the property revert fully to Michael, but Margaret would face penalties for misappropriation of HOA funds and possible criminal charges. For fraud, the courtroom erupted. Some gasped, others whispered in disbelief, and a few applauded before being silenced. By the gavel, Margaret, once the queen of the neighborhood, now sat pale and shaking, her empire reduced to rubble in a single verdict. Michael did not celebrate. He simply nodded, thanked the court, and gathered his papers. His victory was not loud or boastful. It was steady, deliberate, the culmination of patience and truth. The villa was now his, not through force, but through law. Margaret's downfall was not engineered by cruelty, but by her own arrogance. As the crowd dispersed, neighbors avoided Margaret's gaze. She stormed from the courtroom, her heels clattering against the floor, her dignity trailing in tatters. Reporters followed, cameras flashing, questions flying about her misuse of power and looming charges. For the first time, Margaret had no answers. Michael walked out into the sunlight, free of the shadows that had haunted him for months. The villa, towering in its grandeur, no longer mocked him. It was his, not a symbol of loss, but of justice. But even as he stood in quiet triumph, he knew the battle was not entirely over. Margaret still lived in the neighborhood, and her bitterness would not fade easily. The community, fractured by months of deception, would take time to heal, and the villa itself, while now his by law, carried the heavy weight of her arrogance within its walls. The reckoning had ended in victory, but the aftermath was just beginning. The aftermath, weeks following the courtroom verdict, transformed the neighborhood into a stage of shifting allegiances and silent reckonings. Where once Margaret's villa had drawn admiration, it now stood as a monument to her downfall. Neighbors who had fawned over her parties and praised her vision now avoided her entirely. Their greetings cut short, their doors closing quickly. When she walked past, Margaret's reign had ended not with a graceful bow but with humiliation. Her name appeared in headlines, not as the visionary president she fancied herself to be, but as a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. Reporters hounded her for interviews, legal notices piled at her door, and whispers of criminal charges loomed. What had been her crown jewel became her cage, a gilded reminder of everything she had lost. Inside the villa, the silence was deafening. The grand halls, once filled with the sound of music and laughter, echoed with emptiness. Chandeliers still glittered overhead, but no guests admired them. The marble floors still shone, but no footsteps crossed them. The fountains still trickled in the courtyard, but no one stopped to watch. Each detail mocked her. Each luxury turned hollow. The HOA, stripped of its president, scrambled to rebuild. Emergency meetings were held, new leaders appointed, and audits conducted. The discovery of missing funds outraged the community, and efforts began to restore what had been lost. For many, it was a wake-up call, a reminder of how easily power, when unchecked, could corrode trust. Michael, meanwhile, moved with quiet dignity. The villa, by law, was now his. The papers were signed, the deeds transferred, and the keys delivered. Yet he did not rush to claim it. He walked its halls slowly, absorbing the irony of the moment. Every wall, every stone, every inch of the property that Margaret had flaunted as her own was now under his name. And he had not lifted a single hammer, had not spent a single dollar. Neighbors watched curiously as Michael began to make subtle changes. He removed Margaret's crest from the gates, restoring a simple design. He cleared the HOA notices plastered across the entrance, erasing the symbols of her dominance. Gradually, the villa shed its identity as Margaret's empire and became something else entirely, a symbol of patience, resilience, and justice. Yet Michael did not gloat. He did not throw parties or seek admiration. He lived quietly, as he always had, allowing the villa to serve as a silent reminder of what had transpired. For him, victory was not about wealth or status. It was about legacy, the preservation of his family's land, the defense of his rights, and the quiet satisfaction of watching arrogance collapse under its own weight. As for Margaret, her decline was relentless. She resigned from the HOA under pressure, her influence gone. Friends she once commanded abandoned her, unwilling to share in her disgrace. Lawsuits mounted, creditors circled, and the threat of criminal charges grew heavier with each passing day. She clung to what little pride she had left, but it was clear to everyone the woman who once ruled the neighborhood had become its outcast. The community slowly healed. Without Margaret's iron grip, the atmosphere softened. Neighbors greeted one another more freely. Lawns grew with less scrutiny, and meetings shifted from tense confrontations to genuine discussions. The fear that had once lingered in every driveway and backyard faded, replaced by a cautious optimism that things could be better. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael stood at the edge of his property, gazing at the villa, silhouetted against the fiery sky. He thought of his father, of the legacy he had defended, and of the battle he had endured. The land was still his, just as it always had been, but now it carried a story of pride, deception, and justice. The villa gleamed in the twilight, no longer a monument to Margaret's arrogance, but to Michael's resolve. What she had built in vanity, he had claimed in truth, and in that quiet moment, he understood the true weight of victory. It was not loud, it was not boastful. It was steady, enduring, and undeniable. The neighborhood would remember the saga for years to come. The president who built a $6 million villa on land that wasn't hers, and the quiet man who let her finish then, claimed it all. And with that, the story closed, leaving behind a lesson carved into the very foundations of the villa itself. Arrogance builds castles, but truth owns the ground they stand on.